So a bird lands on your windowsill.
Right.
Or, a squirrel dashes across the top of your wooden fence. Maybe a stray cat slinks under a parked car.
Yeah, totally everyday stuff.
Exactly. You see these things every single day, and you probably just assume they are out there, doing their thing.
Just living their little lives.
Right. You watch them, maybe you even narrate their little lives in your head.
Oh, I definitely do that, giving them names.
Yeah, giving them names, motivations, like, oh, Mr. Squirrel is late for a meeting. And for the vast majority of human history, that is exactly what we all did.
We just watched.
We just watched.
Yeah.
We admired their natural instincts, and we naturally projected our own human feelings, our own human anxieties right onto them.
It's just human nature to do that.
It really is. But when you actually peek behind the curtain of biology,
Oh, yeah.
when you look at the raw, unfiltered mechanics of the natural world, that quaint little Disney movie picture completely shatters.
It really does.
You realize you are not just looking at a bird taking a rest on a windowsill.
Yeah.
You are looking at a highly optimized survival machine.
A literal machine, yeah.
You are looking at an organism executing a staggeringly complex series of biological and genetic calculations honed over millions of years just to make it to tomorrow.
It really is a profound, almost dizzying shift in perspective, because when you stop looking at the surface level, the colorful feathers, the soft fur, the behaviors we mistakenly label as like cute or mean.
Right, because nature isn't really cute or mean.
Exactly. And you start looking at the underlying invisible algorithms driving those actions, the whole natural world just transforms.
That's being a peaceful garden.
It completely stops being a peaceful garden and becomes an incredibly complex arena of evolutionary economics.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are taking the source material today, which is Tristram D. Wyatt's book, Animal Behavior. A very short introduction.
Excellent book.
It is. And we are going to look at one of the most incredible paradigm shifts in the history of modern science.
And it really is a massive shift.
We're going to trace how human beings went from simply, watching ducks on a pond and taking polite notes to decoding the ruthlessly pragmatic, invisible genetic math that actually pulls the strings of everything alive.
Everything.
Everything from the exact acoustic frequency a bird uses to sing to the microscopic calculations a meerkat makes when it decides to, spend its afternoon babysitting someone else's kids in the blazing desert sun.
To really understand this transition, it helps to think of it like humanity finally inventing and then putting on a pair of evolutionary X-ray glasses.
Oh, I like that. X-ray glasses.
Yeah, because for centuries we were meticulously cataloging what animals do.
It's just the what.
Right, just the what. But in this deep dive, we are going to explore the scientific blood, sweat, and tears that finally gave us the framework to understand the why they do it.
And getting to that why required tearing down almost everything we thought we knew about nature.
It really did.
But to fully appreciate how revolutionary those X-ray glasses are, we have to understand how blind we were for most of our history.
Right. Or at least how different our vision was.
Yeah, because it's not like humans just started noticing animals 100 years ago.
Yeah.
We have been utterly obsessed with them for millennia.
Well, mostly because our survival literally depended on it.
Exactly. The source material points out these prehistoric cave paintings in southern France.
Like the Chauvet and Lascaux caves.
Yes. We are talking about art that is, 30,000 years old?
30,000 years, yeah. And what is so striking about those prehistoric paintings is the level of behavioral detail.
That's not just stick figures.
Not at all. These weren't just rough sketches of animals standing still like statues. The early humans who painted them depicted highly detailed scenes of deer, bison, and horses in motion.
They were really observing them.
Deeply observing. There is a very famous depiction of a bull sniffing a cow, drawn with an anatomical and behavioral accuracy that a modern biologist would, immediately recognize as courtship behavior. Those early humans understood that observing behavior meant the difference between eating and starving.
Or the difference between living and being eaten themselves.
Exactly.
Right, so their observation was quite literally a matter of life and death. And that intense observational focus continued right through antiquity. You look at someone like Aristotle back in the 4th century BCE. He wrote History of Animals, and he wasn't just, philosophizing in a room. He was out there taking field notes.
He was very hands-on.
He made these surprisingly accurate observations about the habits of European cuckoos, noting how they laid their eggs.
Yeah.
He even documented parental care in catfish. He explicitly noticed that the male catfish is the one that guards the eggs.
which is highly unusual for fish.
Right, and he saw that, and he wrote it down.
Aristotle was remarkably empirical for his time.
Yeah.
But what is fascinating here is how that empirical rigor actually degraded over time.
Wait, we got worse at it.
We really did. As we moved through the centuries, and especially up through the Victorian era in the 19th century, the scientific study of animal behavior lost its edge.
How so?
It became incredibly anecdotal. The literature from that era is heavily steeped in what we call sentimental anthropomorphism.
Okay, hold on. Let's define that term for a second, just so everyone is on the same page. Anthropomorphism is when we attribute human characteristics to non-human things.
Right, correct.
Like saying a cartoon car looks happy.
Yeah, exactly.
But how is this actually showing up in serious scientific literature? I mean, these were scientists.
It was pervasive, honestly. You
Right.
would have naturalists, serious men of science at the time, observing a dog or a bird and openly attributing highly complex human emotional states to them.
Can you give me an example?
So they would see an animal looking lethargic after a fight and write in a scientific journal that the animal was feeling remorse.
Remorse, like he was feeling guilty.
Yes. Or they would see a bird defending its nest and describe it as acting out of a sense of moral duty. They were essentially mapping their own Victorian societal values directly onto the animal kingdom.
I need to ask, why did we do that? Why did it take us so long to stop projecting our own emotional baggage onto animals?
Wow.
Because looking back, it seems incredibly unscientific to watch a lion look out over the savannah and write down that it's feeling regret or, like, melancholy.
Right.
Rather than just acknowledging it's calculating when a gazelle might wander by. It's like watching a Disney movie and assuming the lion actually feels regret rather than calculating its next meal.
It is easy to judge them now, for sure, but you have to realize they simply did not have another framework to apply.
They didn't have the tools.
Exactly. Before the mid-19th century, the prevailing worldview in Western science was that humans were fundamentally separate from animals.
Placed above them.
Placed above them,
Yeah.
yes. And that animals were created in their current static forms.
Ah, I see.
Without an evolutionary framework, if you see a dog acting in a way that looks like human sadness, the most logical tool you have in your intellectual toolkit is to say, the dog is experiencing human sadness.
Right, because what else could it be?
Exactly. It took a massive structural reimagining of what an animal actually is to break that habit.
And that structural reimagining, that total intellectual earthquake, was Charles Darwin.
Absolutely. Charles Darwin is the exception to all that 19th century sentimentalism.
He broke the mold.
He really did.
Right.
When he published The Origin of Species in 1859, the book that introduced natural selection, he didn't just talk about the shape of finch beaks or the length of a tortoise's neck.
The physical stuff?
He included an entire chapter dedicated specifically to instinct.
And according to the source material, he was looking at some incredibly complex stuff.
Oh, very complex.
Like the cuckoos laying their eggs in other birds' nests, or the architectural perfection of honeybees constructing those hexagonal honeycomb cells.
Yes. So Darwin looks at a honeybee creating a perfect hexagon.
Which is wild in itself.
Right. It's a shape that maximizes storage space while minimizing the wax required. And he proposed something entirely radical.
What was it?
He suggested that these complex behaviors, these instincts, were not evidence of divine artistry,
Right.
nor were they whimsical character traits. He proposed that behavior itself is an inherited trait.
Wait, meaning a behavior can be passed down from parent to offspring, just like eye color or height.
Precisely. And because behavior is inherited, it is subject to the exact same brutal pressures of natural selection as any physical trait.
And that makes so much sense.
If a rudimentary accidental behavior, say a bee building a slightly more efficient wax cell, helps that bee survive and produce more offspring.
Then that behavioral trait gets passed on.
Exactly. Over thousands of generations, it is refined and sculpted by natural selection into a highly sophisticated instinct.
That is massive. Darwin essentially strips away the Disney movie projection and says, no, these actions have functional evolutionary origins.
Yeah.
They aren't acting out of moral duty. They are acting out of inherited survival programming.
It laid the absolute foundation for actual scientific rigor in studying behavior.
But I imagine there was a catch.
There was. As with all theoretical breakthroughs, it immediately created a massive practical problem.
Right, because Darwin throws down the gauntlet with the theory. But if you are a young, ambitious scientist living in the early 20th century, how do you actually test that?
That's the million-dollar question.
You can easily measure a bird's beak with a ruler. You can put a feather under a microscope. But how do you put instinct under a microscope?
You can't.
Right, how do you measure a behavior?
That question caused the scientific community to hit a major fork in the road,
The split.
a huge split. In the early 20th century, the pursuit of understanding animal behavior split into two very distinct, often antagonistic factions.
What?
On one side of the fork, you had the experimental psychologists, the guys in the white lab coats.
The behaviorists. This is where we get the really famous names that everyone learns in Psych 101.
Even Pavlov.
John Watson.
B.F. Skinner, exactly. Their approach was defined by extreme control.
Because the real world is too messy.
Way too messy. They believed that the natural world was far too full of unpredictable variables to ever yield hard mathematical data. So they took animals out of the wild, out of the mud and the rain, and brought them into the highly controlled, sterile environment of the laboratory.
So we're talking about Pavlov ringing bells and measuring the exact amount of saliva his dogs produce.
Yes.
Or Skinner putting rats and pigeons into what we now call Skinner boxes.
Yeah, where pushing a specific lever under a specific colored light results in exactly one food pellet dropping down.
It's all about stimulus and response.
Yes. They wanted to study learning and reflexes in an absolute vacuum. They were looking for the universal laws of conditioning.
Okay.
The behaviorist philosophy, at its most extreme, assumed that an animal was essentially a blank slate.
Really? A blank slate?
Pretty much. And that you could understand everything about its behavior simply by perfectly manipulating the stimuli and the rewards it received in that box.
But then you have the other side of the fork, the counter movement.
The guys in the mud?
The scientists who looked at the guys in the white lab coats, looked at the rats in the sterile boxes and said, you are fundamentally missing the entire point of what an animal is.
Exactly. These were the founders of early ethology.
Ethology.
And their philosophy was that if you want to understand an animal, you have to leave the lab, go outside, and get your boots muddy.
These scientists established the discipline of animal behavior as we recognize it in biology today.
They really did.
And the three absolute giants of this early ethological movement were Carl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen.
Their work in the wild was so groundbreaking that they actually ended up sharing the 1973 Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine.
Let's quickly touch on what they were doing out there because it sounds like a completely different universe from a Skinner box.
It was night and day. Carl von Frisch, for instance, spent years decoding the visual world of honeybees.
How do you even do that?
He set up experiments in fields with colored cards and sugar water, proving that bees could not only see color, but that they communicated the exact distance and angle of food sources to the rest of the hive through incredibly complex waggle dances.
Waggle dances. That is amazing.
And then Konrad Lorenz famously studied courtship and development in ducks and geese.
Oh, the imprinting guy.
Yes, the imprinting guy. He discovered the phenomenon. He actually got into the water with baby goslings and proved that they have a critical window right after hatching where they will permanently bond with the first moving object they see.
Which happened to be him.
Which happened to be him.
Which is why there are those famous black and white photos of Lorenz walking through a field with a line of baby geese waggling obediently right behind him.
Exactly. And then there was Nico Tinbergen, who we will talk a lot more about, who did these incredibly meticulous pioneering field experiments on digger wasps and stickleback fish right in their natural habitats.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. I want to pause here and make sure I really grasp the core conflict.
Yeah.
Because the lab coat behaviorists and the muddy boots ethologists are, at the end of the day, studying the exact same biological organism.
They are.
What is the fundamental difference in what these two camps were actually trying to learn?
I think the best way to understand the difference is to think about trying to understand a piece of complex machinery.
Okay, an analogy.
Studying a rat in a Skinner box is a lot like trying to understand how a car works by putting it on a treadmill in a sterile, white, soundproof room.
Oh, I like this. Okay, so if I have the car on the treadmill, I can figure out how the engine turns.
Right.
I can measure the exhaust. I can figure out the mechanics of the transmission.
Exactly. You are learning the internal mechanisms. You are learning how the machine operates in a vacuum.
The nuts and bolts.
The nuts and bolts. That is what the behaviorists were doing. They were learning the mechanisms of memory, reflex, and conditioning.
Right.
But the early ethologists felt that this approach was entirely insufficient if you wanted to understand the animal's true nature.
Because studying a car on a treadmill tells you nothing about why the car has windshield wipers,
Exactly.
or why it has headlights, or why the tires have deep treads. To understand that, you have to take the car off the treadmill and watch it navigate rush hour traffic in a rainstorm.
That is the perfect way to frame it. The ethologists were asking a totally different set of questions.
The why questions.
Yes, they focused on species-level descriptions in the natural habitats where those animals actually evolved. They wanted to know the evolutionary origins of behavior in the real world.
Like, why does this specific duck do this specific elaborate dance in this specific pond?
You cannot possibly answer that by putting the duck in an empty box.
No, of course not.
The ethologists prioritize observation in the wild because they understood that an animal's behavior is inextricably linked to the specific environmental pressures it evolved to survive.
Okay, I see the appeal of the muddy boots approach. It feels much truer to nature,
It is?
but I also see the massive problem they must have run into. If you are out in the mud and the reeds, watching wasps and ducks in the chaos of nature, how do you stop yourself from falling right back into the trap of the 19th century scientists?
Ah, the anthropomorphism trap.
Right. How do you prevent yourself from just watching a duck dance and saying, oh, he's dancing because he's feeling romantic today? You need a framework to keep the science rigorous.
And that is exactly what they built.
So they did.
They did. To truly understand how these early ethologists operated, we have to look at the intellectual toolkit they created to process the chaos of the wild.
Okay.
Specifically, a framework built by Nico Tinbergen.
Tinbergen again.
Yes. It is a framework so fundamentally brilliant, so logically airtight, that modern biologists still use it as the gold standard today.
Let's get into this, because the source material heavily emphasizes this. Tinbergen realized that simply observing behavior wasn't enough. You had to interrogate it systematically.
Interrogate is a good word for it.
He proposed that to fully comprehend any behavior, you have to look at it from 4 distinct complementary perspectives.
Tinbergen's 4 questions.
Right, Tinbergen's 4 questions.
The beauty of Tinbergen's 4 questions is that they force a scientist to look at a behavior in both the immediate present and the deep evolutionary past.
Let's walk through them.
Okay, the first question you must ask is about its function.
Function.
Basically, what is this behavior actually for? How does this specific action directly help the animal survive, find food, or increase its success in reproducing right now?
Okay, so function is about immediate survival value. What's the second question?
The second question is about development.
Development.
How does this specific behavior develop over the course of the individual animal's lifetime?
Good.
Is it entirely hardwired from birth, or does it require learning? How do the animal's genes interact with its specific environment as it grows up to produce this action?
So if a bird sings a song, function asks, does this song attract a mate?
Right.
And development asks, did the bird know the song when it hatched, or did it have to listen to its father sing it for 3 months to learn it?
Exactly. Perfect example. Then we move to the third question, which is about the mechanism.
Mechanism.
What are the immediate internal or external triggers that cause the behavior to happen right at this very second?
Like what's pushing the button?
Exactly. Is it a sudden rush of testosterone? Is it a specific neural pathway firing in the brain? Or is it triggered by an external cue, like the length of daylight changing in the spring?
So mechanism is the physical nuts and bolts, the actual gears turning inside the animal.
Yes. And finally, the fourth question is about evolution.
Evolution.
How did this behavior evolve over vast stretches of historical evolutionary time? What did this behavior look like in the animal's ancestors 1 million years ago? How does it compare to similar behaviors in closely related species today?
Function, development, mechanism, evolution. It's a complete 360-degree view.
It covers all the bases.
But to really see how elegant this toolkit is in the field, we need to look at how Tinbergen actually applied it.
Oh, absolutely.
The source material highlights one of his most classic experiments involving the black-headed gull. Can you walk us through what he was looking at there?
Oh, this is a great one. So, Tinbergen spent a massive amount of time in the sand dunes of the Netherlands, observing colonies of black-headed gulls.
Okay.
These gulls nest on the ground, in the sand and grass. And Tinbergen noticed a very specific, almost obsessive-compulsive behavioral quirk.
What was it?
Whenever a baby gull chick hatched out of its egg, the parent gull would immediately pick up the empty, broken eggshell in its beak, fly a considerable distance away from the nest, drop the shell, and then fly back.
Which, on the surface, seems like a tremendous waste of precious energy.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the chick is already successfully hatched. You are a tired parent bird. Why expend the calories to clean up the trash? Why not just leave the shell there?
That is exactly the mystery. It looks counterproductive. But Tinbergen applied his framework, starting with the function question.
Right. What is the immediate survival value?
He hypothesized that the behavior must serve a survival purpose. Now, the outside of a gull egg is a speckled, camouflaged brown, which blends in perfectly with the sand and grass.
Makes sense, to hide from predators.
But the inside of the broken shell is a stark, brilliant white.
Ah.
Yeah.
So a breaking shell is a visual anomaly in a brown landscape.
Exactly. Tinbergen hypothesized that the white, jagged insides of the broken eggshells acted as a massive visual beacon for predators flying overhead.
Like, hey, fresh meat over here.
Exactly.
What's that mean?
Specifically, carrion crows, which love to eat gull eggs and helpless newborn chicks. Leaving the broken shell next to the nest might act like a neon sign pointing right to a vulnerable meal.
But hypothesis isn't proof.
No, it's not.
How do you prove that in the wild without putting the gulls in a sterile lab box?
You bring the rigor of the lab into the wild.
Okay.
Tinbergen set up a meticulous field experiment. He painted wooden dummy eggs to perfectly match the camouflage of real gull eggs, and he laid them out in the dunes.
Fake nests.
Fake nests. Then he took broken white eggshells and placed them at varying highly specific distances from these dummy nests.
Okay, so he's testing the distance.
Right. Some shells were placed 15 centimeters away, some 100 centimeters away, and some 200 centimeters away. And then he just sat in a blind for hours and watched the crows fly over.
He essentially set up a buffet for the crows to see what they would notice first.
And the results were overwhelmingly clear. He proved statistically that the closer the stark white empty shell was to the camouflage nest, the more likely the crows were to spot it, dive down, and eat the dummy eggs.
Wow.
By flying the shell far away, the parent gull was removing the visual beacon.
So the function of the shell removal behavior is anti-predator defense.
Yes.
It dramatically increases the offspring's chances of survival.
Right.
It's not housekeeping, it's a security measure.
Precisely. And this is why Tinbergen's framework was so revolutionary. It forced the entire scientific community to stop looking for a single simplistic answer.
You couldn't just say, it's instinct.
Right. You couldn't just throw your hands up and say, well, the gull removes the shell because it's instinct. You had to explain the immediate survival function, the physiological triggers making the parent pick it up, and the deep evolutionary history of ground nesting birds.
It demanded multi-layered biological proof.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was an incredibly thorough toolkit.
It sounds incredibly thorough. It sounds like they finally figured it out.
Wow.
But the source material suggests that even with this brilliant four-question toolkit, these early ethologists, even Nobel Prize winners like Tinbergen and Lorenz, still harbored a massive fundamental blind spot about how evolution actually worked.
They did, and it was a blind spot born out of human intuition.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
Despite all their rigorous field tests, the early ethologists still largely viewed animal behaviors as existing for the good of the species.
What does that actually mean in practice? For the good of the species?
It means they assumed that natural selection favored traits that helped the entire species survive over time. In their minds, the gull removes the eggshell, not just to save its own specific chick, but so that gulls as a species will continue to thrive and populate the earth.
Like a deep effort.
Exactly. They saw the animal kingdom as this grand cooperative enterprise where individuals naturally acted to preserve their kind.
That sounds very nice. Almost comforting.
Right.
Why is that a blind spot?
Because biologically and mathematically, it is completely wrong.
Wrong.
Completely wrong. That foundational assumption contained a fatal flaw. And in the 1960s and 1970s, exposing that flaw caused biology to undergo a total violent revolution.
A revolution.
We are talking about a complete paradigm shift in how we view life on Earth.
This brings us to what the source text focuses heavily on, the era of the selfish gene.
Ah, yes. The selfish gene.
We are talking about the work of the American evolutionary biologist George C. Williams in 1966, and then Richard Dawkins, who absolutely blew the doors off the concept and brought it to the public with his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene.
A massively influential book.
They took Darwin's concept of natural selection, and they completely shifted the lens.
They introduced what we now call the gene's eye view of evolution, and it shattered that comforting good of the species illusion forever.
How so?
Well, To understand why the old view fails, you have to understand the mathematics of a cheater.
Walk me through the cheater.
Let's imagine a hypothetical population of birds that operates under the old good of the species model.
Okay, cooperative birds.
Right. Let's say there is a food shortage in the forest. To ensure the species doesn't overpopulate and eat all the food, driving everyone to extinction, all the birds graciously agree to lay only 2 eggs this year, instead of their usual 6.
They are cooperating for the greater good.
Exactly. Everyone limits their breeding to save the forest.
Sounds like a solid plan.
But what happens if a genetic mutation occurs in just one single bird, and that mutation makes her entirely selfish?
Oh boy.
She doesn't care about the forest or the species. She lays 10 eggs.
And because everyone else is only laying 2, there's actually enough food for her 10 chicks to survive.
Exactly. So the selfish bird has 10 surviving babies, and the cooperative birds only have 2.
Right.
And those 10 babies carry the selfish genetic mutation. When they grow up, they all lay 10 eggs.
Ah, I see the problem.
Within just a few generations, the selfish genes will have completely out-reproduced the cooperative genes. The altruistic good of the species birds will be bred out of existence by the cheaters.
The nice guys finish last.
Literally extinct. The math proves that group selection evolution acting to preserve the species is inherently unstable. It simply cannot withstand the invasion of selfish mutants.
Wait, hold on. I need to step in here just thinking about this from the perspective of our listeners. Are you saying that evolution doesn't care about the species at all?
Not even a little bit.
Are you saying the individual animal itself doesn't actually matter?
That is exactly what Williams and Dawkins argued. Natural selection does not operate at the level of the species, and it doesn't even really operate at the level of the individual animal.
Then what does it operate on?
Natural selection operates strictly at the microscopic level of the genes.
The genes.
Individual animals, you, me, the black-headed gull, the rat in the maze, we are merely what Dawkins controversially called survival machines.
Survival machines.
Yes. We are temporary, disposable vehicles constructed by our genes.
Disposable.
Our bodies, our brains, our behaviors, they are all just complex machinery built for one solitary purpose: to ensure that the genes writing inside us leave more copies of themselves in the next generation.
Okay, wait, so it's like the animal is just the getaway car.
The getaway car.
Yeah, like the animal's just the getaway car, but the genes are the bank robbers, sitting in the back seat, actually calling the shots, stepping on the gas and steering the wheel.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to put it.
The car itself might get completely junked after the heist, but as long as the robbers get away with the cash, the genetic code, and make it to the next safe house, that is an evolutionary win.
That analogy captures the brutal pragmatism of it perfectly. The animal's body and its instincts are just the engine and the tires of that getaway car, designed by the genes to help the genes replicate.
That is wild.
The genes are immortal. The animal is just a temporary vessel.
I can see why this was a revolution. It strips away any lingering romance about nature.
It's pure mathematics.
But theories need data. How did scientists actually prove that animals were acting as selfish genetic vehicles in the wild, rather than cooperating for the species?
One of the most famous pieces of evidence came from a biologist named David Lack.
David Lack.
Yes. He conducted a massive long-term study on a type of bird called the great tit, living in the woods near Oxford. Lack was looking at clutch size, the number of eggs a bird lays in a single nest.
Under the old good of the species idea, the assumption was that the birds laid a specific number of eggs to keep the forest population stable, right?
Exactly, that they were restraining themselves. But Lack meticulously counted eggs, tracked survival rates, and even artificially added or removed eggs from nests to see what would happen.
And what did he find?
His data showed something entirely different from communal restraint. The birds were not limiting their clutch size for the good of the species at all. They were ruthlessly optimizing their clutch size to maximize the number of their own surviving offspring.
How does that optimization work? Why not just lay 30 eggs if you want to be selfish?
Because raising chicks requires massive amounts of energy.
Right.
Lack found that if a bird laid too few eggs, she simply produced fewer babies than her neighbors, and her genetic legacy suffered.
Sure.
But if you laid too many eggs, say 12 instead of 8, she and her mate physically could not catch enough caterpillars to feed all 12 screaming mouths.
Oh, so they'd spread the food too thin.
Precisely. The chicks would be malnourished, and many, if not all, would starve before leaving the nest.
So by trying to raise 12, she actually ends up with 0 surviving babies.
Right. But Lack found that by laying the exact mathematically optimum number, which for these birds was usually around 8 or 9 eggs, she ensured the maximum possible number of strong, healthy offspring survived to reproduce the next year.
Wow.
The birds weren't holding back to help the forests. They were laying exactly the maximum number of eggs they could afford to successfully rear.
It was an entirely selfish, economically calculated behavior designed purely to maximize genetic replication.
Exactly. The shorthand of a gene for behavior simply means a mutation that leads to a behavioral advantage that helps that specific genetic sequence replicate.
Okay, so this new math-driven selfish gene theory completely takes over the biological sciences.
It completely dominated.
It proves that every behavior is essentially a microscopic economic transaction for genetic survival. But how did this actually change the way scientists observed animals back out in the mud and dirt? Because it didn't send them back to the sterile behaviorist labs, right? It birthed a whole new subfield.
Yes, it created the modern discipline of behavioral ecology.
Behavioral ecology.
Behavioral ecology is the marriage of ethology, watching what animals actually do in the wild with ecology, the harsh environmental constraints they do it in.
So observing them, but with the math glasses on.
Exactly. But now, instead of looking at how behaviors benefit the group, behavioral ecologists look strictly at the individual costs and benefits of a behavior. They look at animals as strategic investors of time and energy.
And according to the source text, there is no better, more fascinating example of this modern approach than the ongoing study of the Kalahari desert meerkats.
Oh, the meerkats! The Meerkat Project in the Kalahari is legendary.
If you have ever seen an animal documentary, you know meerkats.
For sure. They are those highly social, tiny mongooses that stand up perfectly straight on their hind legs, looking like little sentinels scanning the horizon.
The source material notes that these specific meerkats have been studied by researchers for so many generations that they are completely habituated to humans.
Habituation is a painstaking process. Researchers have spent years just sitting near them, moving slowly, until the meerkats realize the humans are neither predators nor prey.
So they just ignore them?
Completely. Today, the meerkats treat the scientists like moving furniture. In fact, they are so habituated that if a scientist puts a digital weighing scale on the sand and puts a tiny crumb of hard-boiled egg on it, the meerkat will willingly step onto the scale to be weighed.
Which gives researchers an incredible stream of hard, quantifiable data. They can track the exact body weight of an individual animal day by day, hour by hour.
Exactly. Now let's contrast the two eras of study using these meerkats.
Okay.
Back in the 1960s, if early observational ethologists looked at a meerkat colony, they described it in general species-level terms.
Right. The good of the species lens.
They noted that meerkats lived in groups of 20 or 30, and they specifically noted that subordinate meerkats, the younger adults who are not the dominant breeding pair, spent a huge amount of their time babysitting the newest litter of pups.
Meaning they stayed back at the burrow to guard the babies, while the rest of the group went out to forage for food.
Yes. And under the old paradigm, this was viewed as a beautiful cooperative trait.
It says beautiful.
It was seen as the meerkats working together for the good of the meerkat species. It takes a village to raise a child.
So what does this all mean for the meerkats today? The modern behavioral ecologists, armed with the selfish gene theory and those digital scales, they look at that exact same babysitting behavior and ask a very different, very cynical question.
They do. They ask, what is the cost to the individual babysitter?
Because babysitting isn't free.
Because when you look at the data, babysitting is extremely expensive. The Kalahari is a brutal environment.
Oh, I'm sure.
Every hour, a subordinate meerkat spends sitting at the burrow guarding someone else's pups is an hour it loses for digging up beetles and scorpions to feed itself.
And the scientists can actually measure that cost.
Down to the gram. The scales show that a meerkat loses roughly 1% of its total body weight during a single babysitting shift.
1% of body weight in a single shift. That's massive.
Over a season, that loss of body condition means the babysitter is less likely to survive the winter, less likely to ever become a dominant breeder, and more likely to be killed by a predator like a martial eagle because it is physically weaker.
So if evolution is driven exclusively by selfish genes trying to maximize their own replication in the next generation, we have a massive glaring paradox.
A huge paradox.
Why on earth would an individual meerkat sacrifice its own body weight, its own safety, and its own future breeding chances just to feed someone else's baby?
That is the million-dollar question. If genes are entirely selfish, altruism, true, selfless charity should not exist in nature.
It shouldn't exist at all.
Behaviors like meerkat babysitting, or a bird feeding chicks that aren't its own,
Right.
or a worker bee dying to sting an intruder, should have been ruthlessly weeded out by natural selection instantly.
Because the cheaters would take over.
The cheaters who refused to babysit and only ate food should have taken over.
It seems like a fatal flaw in the selfish gene theory. It's the altruism puzzle. How did they solve it?
It was a massive stumbling block. But in the 1960s, a brilliant evolutionary biologist named W.D. Hamilton solved the puzzle.
W.D. Hamilton.
He introduced a concept called inclusive fitness, which is more commonly known today as kin selection, and he solved it with math.
Let's break down this math, because it is the key to unlocking almost all complex animal societies.
Okay, so Hamilton realized that everyone was thinking about genetic replication too narrowly. You don't just pass on copies of your genes by having your own direct offspring.
Because you share DNA with your family members.
Exactly. You can pass on copies of your exact same genes indirectly by helping your blood relatives survive and reproduce.
So if my sibling survives, a large portion of my own genetic code survives with them.
Exactly. Hamilton created a mathematical formula for this, known as Hamilton's rule. It is incredibly elegant.
What's the formula?
It states that an altruistic behavior will evolve if, and only if, the benefit to the relative receiving the help, multiplied by the degree of genetic relatedness between the two animals, is strictly greater than the cost to the helper.
Okay, let's put some numbers to this to make it concrete. Let's talk about the fractions of relatedness.
Sure. In sexual reproduction, you get half your DNA from your mother and half from your father.
Right.
Therefore, on average, you share exactly 1/2 or 50% of your genes with a full sibling.
Okay, 50% for a sibling.
You share 1/4 or 25% with a nephew or niece. And you share 1/8 or 12.5% of your genes with a first cousin.
Right. And there's a very famous anecdote about this from J.B.S. Haldane, a British biologist from the 1930s, long before Hamilton formalized the math.
Oh, I love this story.
Haldane was supposedly sitting in a pub doing some rough calculations on the back of an envelope, and someone asked him if he would sacrifice his own life to save a drowning brother.
And what did he say?
He quipped, "No, I would not lay down my life for one brother, but I would happily lay down my life to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins."
It sounds like a joke, but mathematically, it is flawlessly accurate regarding genetic legacy.
Let's run the math on that.
If you die to save one brother, you lose 100% of your future reproductive potential, but you only save 50% of your shared genes. That's a genetic loss.
You're in the red?
But if you die to save 2 brothers, you save 2 halves, which equals 100%.
Oh.
If you die to save 8 cousins, 8 times 1/8 equals 100%. Your genetic legacy breaks even.
It's like looking at a family inheritance. If I have a massive fortune, the genes, and I have no children, but I leave my entire fortune to my 2 siblings, my familial wealth is preserved exactly as well as if I had left all of it to one biological child.
That's a great way to think about it.
The genes are just currency. They do not care whose wallet they are in, as long as the currency stays in circulation and gets invested in the next generation.
That is exactly right. The genes are blind to the vehicle. So let's bring that math back to the Kalahari meerkats.
The babysitter's losing 1% of their weight.
The subordinate meerkat who's babysitting is almost always an older sibling to the pups it is watching. It shares 50% of its genes with those babies.
Okay.
If staying behind and losing a little body weight raises the survival rate of those highly related pups enough to offset the helper's own loss of direct breeding opportunities, the math balances.
Because they're saving 50% of their own genes over and over.
Exactly. The gene for babysitting thrives because it is rescuing copies of itself located in the bodies of the pups.
So the babysitting isn't actually selfless at all. It is genetic selfishness disguised as behavioral altruism.
It is entirely self-serving from the perspective of the gene. But this raises an important question. Understanding this math immediately raises another intensely complicated problem for field biologists.
Let me guess. How do the animals actually run the math?
More specifically, how do the animals know who their relatives actually are? Hamilton's rule only works if the altruism is directed strictly at kin.
Yeah, if a meerkat accidentally babysits for a completely unrelated rival family, it suffers the cost without gaining any indirect genetic benefit.
It's a total loss. But animals don't have birth certificates. They don't have family trees. How does a ground squirrel know its sister from a total stranger?
That is mind-boggling. Do they actually have a mechanism to detect DNA?
The source text discusses a few fascinating mechanisms that have evolved for kin recognition. One of the most incredible is called the armpit effect.
The armpit effect.
Richard Dawkins actually coined the term. It's essentially phenotype matching or self-matching.
The armpit effect, how does that work?
The logic is, if this other animal smells like me, it probably shares my genes.
Okay, smell.
Scientists have studied this extensively in Belding's ground squirrels. These squirrels hibernate for months underground. When they all emerge in the spring, it is a chaotic mix of individuals.
Just squirrels everywhere.
But researchers discovered through meticulous cross-fostering experiments where they secretly swapped babies between nests that these squirrels actually use specific scent glands to sniff each other.
Wait, they sniff a stranger, and then what? They somehow compare it to their own smell?
Exactly. They learn their own scent profile, their own armpit, and they use it as a template.
That is wild.
When they meet a stranger, they compare the stranger's scent to their own template. If the scents match closely, they treat the stranger as kin and will act cooperatively.
And if they don't match?
If the scents don't match, they treat them as a rival and will fight them or chase them away. They are literally sniffing out genetic relatedness.
That is incredibly sophisticated. But do all animals have to rely on complex chemical scent matching? Are there simpler ways to make sure you are helping your relatives?
Well, evolution is lazy, or rather, it favors the simplest effective solution.
Sure.
Many animals don't bother with complex scent matching. They just use simple environmental rules of thumb.
Like what?
For many nesting birds, the evolutionary rule of thumb is simply, if a baby chick is located inside the physical boundaries of my nest, it must carry my genes, so I will feed it.
Which 99% of the time is a perfectly sound assumption. If it's in your nest, you laid it.
Right. It works perfectly, until another species figures out how to hack the algorithm.
Oh, no.
This is exactly what the European cuckoo does, which goes all the way back to the observations of Aristotle and Darwin we talked about earlier.
The cuckoo.
The cuckoo is a brood parasite. The mother cuckoo sneaks into the nest of a smaller bird, like a reed warbler, lays her egg, and flies away.
And because the reed warbler is operating on that simple rule of thumb, feed whatever's in my nest, it feeds the cuckoo chick.
It feeds it relentlessly. The cuckoo chick usually hatches first, pushes the warbler's actual eggs out of the nest to kill them.
Brutal.
And then the warbler parents will spend weeks exhaustively bringing food to this massive cuckoo chick that is often 3 times their size.
Because their brains can't compute the deception.
Simply because their behavioral programming cannot override the if it's in my nest, feed it rule. It is a tragic exploitation of kin selection logic.
Nature really is ruthless. Okay, so kin selection and Hamilton's math perfectly explain why a meerkat will give up a few hours of foraging to babysit a sibling, or why a bird will feed a nestling.
Right.
But the source material pushes this concept even further. What happens when we take Hamilton's genetic math to its absolute, most extreme, terrifyingly logical conclusion?
Oh, this is where it gets crazy. When you push the math to the absolute extreme, you arrive at the ultimate expression of inclusive fitness. Eusociality.
Eusociality. This is where things transition from fascinating to truly alien. Let's define it.
Eusociality is a social structure where animals live in massive colonies characterized by a strict reproductive division of labor.
Meaning?
What that means in plain English is that the vast majority of the individuals in the colony, sometimes millions of them, are completely, permanently sterile workers.
Millions of sterile workers.
They will never mate, they will never have their own offspring. They dedicate their entire grueling lives exclusively to foraging, building, and defending the colony, all to help one single female, the queen, reproduce.
We usually associate this with insects, right? Ants, bees, wasps.
Yes, the social insects are the classic examples. But the source text points out that we also see this exact same extreme social structure in mammals.
Mammals, real.
Specifically, the naked mole rat.
Naked mole rats, they sound delightful.
They are biologically fascinating, if not conventionally attractive. They live in the incredibly harsh, arid desert regions of East Africa, and they live in colonies of up to 300 individuals entirely underground.
301 colony.
You have dozens and dozens of sterile workers endlessly digging miles of tunnels through rock-hard dirt with their teeth. Searching for scattered tubers to eat. And they do all this to bring food back to support one single massively enlarged breeding queen and her 1 or 2 male mates.
Why does this happen? We just established that genes are selfish and want to replicate. Why would 300 mammals completely surrender their right to reproduce?
It seems backward.
How does the gene for sterility possibly get passed on?
It all comes down to Hamilton's math. RBC, relatedness, benefit, and cost. For eusociality to evolve, two conditions usually have to be met.
Okay, condition one.
First, strict monogamy in the founding pair is absolutely crucial. If the queen and her single mate are strictly monogamous over their lifetimes, it means a profound thing mathematically. All the sterile worker offspring are exactly as related to their new siblings as they would be to their own direct offspring.
Wait, let me process that. Because they share the exact same parents.
Right.
So genetically, for a worker mole rat, raising a sister is mathematically identical to raising a daughter.
Exactly.
The genetic payout is exactly the same, 50%.
Exactly. So the relatedness factor, the R in the equation, is very high.
Yeah.
Now you plug in the environmental factors, the cost C and the benefit B.
Right, because they live in a harsh desert.
The East African desert is unforgiving. If a single naked mole rat decides to leave the colony and try to dig its own tunnels and breed on its own, the cost is catastrophic.
It's just too hard.
The chance of surviving, finding a mate, and successfully rearing pups alone in that hard dirt is near zero.
So the cost of leaving is basically certain death.
Right. Therefore, the cost of giving up personal reproduction is actually very low because personal reproduction was doomed to fail anyway.
That makes a grim kind of sense.
But if they stay in the safety of the established colony, protected by hundreds of siblings, and help the queen raise hundreds of highly related new sisters, the indirect genetic benefit, B, is massive.
The math overwhelmingly, undeniably favors staying and being a sterile worker.
It is stunning. They aren't oppressed workers. They're genetic investors making the only logical play available to them.
Precisely. And when you look at the insect world, the scale of this genetic investment becomes incomprehensible.
Oh, the insects take it to a whole other level.
The source mentions the macroterms termites in Africa.
Yes.
The individual blind workers are only about 5 millimeters long. But working together, they construct massive, structurally perfect mud towers that can reach 5 meters tall.
5 meters. That is the equivalent of humans building a skyscraper thousands of stories high.
And these mounds aren't just piles of dirt. They are marvels of engineering.
Unbelievable engineering.
They contain specialized chambers for the queen, nurseries for the larvae, and intricate internal fungal gardens where they cultivate their food.
They even have complex structural chimneys that catch the wind to actively air condition the mound, keeping the internal temperature and humidity perfectly regulated despite the blazing savanna sun outside.
And the craziest part is there is no architect. There is no termite foreperson holding a blueprint.
None. They accomplish all of this purely through local chemical rules.
Chemicals.
They use pheromones, chemical scent markers, to trigger building behaviors in their neighbors. If one termite puts down a pellet of mud laced with a specific pheromone, it compels the next termite to put a pellet on top of it, eventually forming an arch and then a tunnel.
In this scenario, where millions of sterile individuals are operating on chemical autopilot to build a skyscraper for one queen, the idea of an individual animal totally breaks down, doesn't it?
It completely dissolves. In eusocial colonies, natural selection is essentially acting on the colony level.
Because the individual doesn't reproduce.
The individual termite doesn't matter anymore. It is as disposable as a single skin cell on your arm. The entire massive colony of millions of insects has become essentially a single genetic vehicle.
Wow.
It is a single, sprawling survival machine designed solely for the queen's reproductive output.
That is just wow.
Yeah.
We have covered an immense amount of intellectual ground today.
We really have.
We started tens of thousands of years ago with early humans painting deer on the walls of Chauvet Cave, driven by survival observation.
Right.
We moved past Aristotle's early notes, right through the sentimental anthropomorphic mush of the 19th century.
Where animals felt remorse.
Exactly. Until Darwin sparked the fire of behavioral evolution. We explore the great schism between the lab maze behaviorists isolating reflexes and the muddy boots ethologists observing nature's rush hour traffic.
The car on the treadmill.
We broke down Tinbergen's brilliant, four-pronged interrogation of function and evolution. And finally, we arrived at the cold, beautiful, staggering math of the selfish gene, the paradox of kin selection, and these massive eusocial colonies acting as single, terrifyingly efficient organisms.
It is a completely, irrevocably different way of looking at the natural world.
You can never look at a bird on a windowsill the same way again.
It fundamentally rewires your perception of life. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder deeply as you look out at the animals around you, and perhaps, more importantly, as you look at the people around you.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have spent this entire time seeing how complex behaviors in the wild are mathematically governed by genes. From groupers and moray eels hunting cooperatively in coral reefs, to New Caledonian crows fashioning tiny hooks out of twigs to fish for grubs, to the intense sacrificial social bonds of primates and meerkats.
Yeah.
It is all ultimately driven by the invisible, pragmatic imperative to replicate selfish genetic code. So, the inevitable question is, what does that mean for us?
Oh, man.
Homo sapiens are biological animals subject to the exact same evolutionary history. Can human culture, our incredibly complex languages, our profound philosophies, and our highest artistic achievements ever truly transcend our biological programming?
Are we immune?
Or when you strip away our arrogance, our most noble acts of charity, our most profound cultural institutions, and our deepest loves just highly complex, beautifully disguised survival mechanisms deployed by our own selfish genes to ensure we keep replicating?
Man, are we just the most sophisticated getaway cars ever built?
It's something to think about.
That is a remarkably heavy thought to walk away with, but it's exactly why we do this. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden machinery of the natural world. And remember, whatever you are observing out there, whether it's a meerkat in the desert or a stranger on the subway, stay intensely curious.